go ahead and get started. I'll just say that this is Ceil Strauss with the Minnesota Floodplain Program. I'm the state floodplain manager, and I'll be presenting today. And Gary Bennett, my coworker here, is helping with monitoring the notes and other support. So welcome everyone. I'm going to turn off my camera and get started with the actual presentation. We're talking about flood response and substantial damage determinations. And this is basically the same presentation we gave 2 years ago, but with updates to the links and those kinds of things. So we'll get right into it here. The main topics, I'll be focusing on a lot of the preparation and resources for being better prepared for floods that we've got available for local officials. Reminder of your responsibilities as local officials related to flooding, and talking a little bit more in detail about making substantial damage determinations. So we do have resources on our website. A lot of them are on our preparation, response, and recovery page, which looks like this. In particular, we've got a couple videos we did like 2 years ago. And there's a lot of overlap between what we'll cover today and what's in these videos, but these we got down to like 15-minute videos, one focused on preparation and one focused on the response and recovery. Then also, and this is something people sometimes overlook, is this is one of those expanding spots here. This is a summary of the resources that were in these videos, just trying to put them all in one place so people could find some of those resources. Starting off, do you know what's in your all-hazard plan? Counties will have a county all-hazard plan. In a few cases, the bigger cities have their own, but hopefully your community was involved in writing that all-hazard plan and you know what's in there. But then for many communities where you've got higher risk, do you have a disaster response plan? And some of our communities that have had repeated flooding have some really nice plans. They've got a lot of details. They know exactly what parts of the city or county they need to be responding to or doing evacuation. So we'll be talking just about a few reminders and a few resources, templates for that kind of planning. Then also the reminder of once you've got a plan, do you have some kind of a regular update? And do you know whether the contacts and responsible parties have been updated? We definitely recommend at least an annual check and getting it into your calendars and getting things updated and reviewing your plan with any new staff, or just if you haven't had a flood in a while, just reviewing what's in there. And the U.S. Corps of Engineers has a really nice emergency action plan guidebook and other great resources. And here's the St. Paul Corps page on their emergency operations assistance. A couple of things that they have that I'll point out is here's where you can get the emergency action plan. And that looks like this. It was last updated in 2019. As far as I know, they haven't updated that one again. But that's got really nice templates. And if your county hasn't had a workshop with the Corps, that's something that our St. Paul Corps folks will set up a workshop at the county level and kind of step through how to use this plan and getting the communities and the county to coordinate on what that action plan is going to look like. And they set it up purposely with different chapters that you can work on the things applicable in your community, chip away at it, and make updates as makes sense in your community. And they did that actually in response because they had been asked, well, do you have some good examples? And they started looking around and realized there really weren't that many good examples out there. So they got some special funding and put together this template. The other thing on this page is the Community Resource Toolbox, kind of a inconspicuous little link here, but you click on that, you can see a lot more information, guidance for flood prep or flood response. In particular, they've got their flood response manual that did get updated more recently. Honestly, I like their old cover better, but hey, they've got this new updated flood response manual. They've also got some nice stuff about sandbags and other kinds of barriers, and they've got a couple little videos that have been updated more recently. So some useful stuff there. The folks here at Department of Labor and Industry that work with the codes, the state codes, they've got some really informative stuff on their page. In particular, they've got this disaster preparedness manual for building officials. And that was updated a few years ago. So that's got a lot more information and step-by-step information. And it's really focused at building officials, but it's useful for others. The other thing to look at is what kind of communication makes sense in your community and being ready to get that communication out ahead of time, especially those of you that are on bigger rivers, you have more warning time. Those of you that are in flashier flood situations, you won't have as much warning time. So it's probably even more important to know what your communication is going to be when you do get a flood, because you won't have a lot of time to think about it and say, oh, it's looking like we're going to get flooded here in a couple of weeks. We better do something. You look at who in your community is most at risk. What parts of the community? Do you have any vulnerable citizens in your community? What messages do they need to hear? Some of the things that you can include are instructions on how to look at the FEMA maps in your community and know whether they're in a higher mapped risk area, to consider their low spots in the area and look at, gee, I've got a stormwater pond right near me, or if I've got this little creek here, or whatever, that help people understand, maybe based on past floods where you've had areas that are slower draining or that are at higher risk and maybe not on the official map. Encourage folks to look at the records for their buildings and know what their lowest floor elevations are. City of Moorhead's got a great website where folks can increase the flood levels in half-foot increments and see if the flooding would be on the parcel, on the individual parcels. So folks can know that, if the flood level's predicted to be at 20 feet on the gauge, that they can look and see, well, what does that mean on my property? And for those of you that have bigger flood-prone areas and more often get flooding, that's a really helpful thing to have. The other thing to think about in the messaging is sometimes people think those old emergency levees that are still there from the 60s are protecting them, and need a little bit of education if they're not certified levees and they're not really protecting them, but helping people to understand what areas do have protection, what kind of protection they have. Also, to strongly consider flood insurance, that it's only going to be mandatory if their building is in the FEMA mapped areas and they have a federally backed loan. But reminders that anyone in your participating communities can get flood insurance, and that if they're near one of those flood prone areas, or if they're in one of those areas FEMA doesn't have mapped, that locally is flood prone, something definitely to consider. Or have backup records off-site. I was talking to one of our emergency managers who had started working with some bigger government facilities and was kind of surprised at how many of the records they had in their basement and didn't have backup records. And that's something that many of us are working on, getting paper records digitized. That's certainly what we're doing in the Floodplain program, is getting our records digitized, both for easier access, but so we have backups of those things. We're up on the 5th floor, so I'm not so worried about flooding, but other things can happen. But certainly where folks have records in the lower levels of buildings that are at risk, having some backup plans, and how are they going to move things from the lower levels? Do they have a place to put their inventory when they know that there might be flooding coming or they're at risk? Do they have a safe place for their family and their employees to go? Do they want to be putting up or be prepared to put up some temporary dikes or walls? And there's different products out there now for that. And many of the communities do help supply sandbags. But all these things take planning and take thinking ahead of time, preferably. because once any of the communities who have regularly deal with flooding can tell you that, the more you're doing ahead of time to plan, the better, because you're going to be really busy putting out fires when the flooding's going on. This is a PSA that FEMA has. It's really kind of cute. It's basically, they're talking about what's their emergency plan for flooding. And they're basically talking about how they're not prepared. And as it says, they end up saying, well, we're just going to kind of wing it. And it ends with winging it is not an emergency plan. But I do have the link here so you can take a look at that little 30-second PSA. That's kind of fun. And it might be something that you could be sharing in your community, encouraging families and businesses to be prepared for flooding. So some other kinds of considerations for your community: look at where you need the temporary dikes and walls. Here's a couple examples. Here's in a city where they've blocked off the road there that's in a low spot. Another place where they've got a longer temporary type berm. But a reminder that when you're looking at where you're going to put those temporary dikes, look at your floodplain map. And remember that your floodway is the area that you're supposed to keep open for the water to go. That's the area where during flooding you expect higher velocities, deeper depths of flooding. We do not want to be blocking that. So don't put your levees or sandbags blocking parts of the floodway. And we have seen some communities do that in the past. So just a reminder that when you're looking at your plan of where you do need the temporary levees or dikes, don't put them in your floodway, because that's going to cause problems. It's going to increase flooding in other parts of the town as a result, because you need that area for the flowing water during the floods. And same thing on the newer maps here. Don't put your sandbags or levees in the floodway. The other thing to think about is, where are your fill sources? As the water starts coming up, some of the sources communities had planned to use get underwater faster than they expected. And I kind of like this picture here. You can see that you've got this soccer goal here, and they were having to take material from the soccer field, I think in part because some of the closer, more accessible areas were going to be underwater too soon, or there were buildings there, or that kind of thing. This is not the preferred place, I'm sure, to get their fill that they needed for their temporary levees, but think about where you are going to get those fill sources. The other thing is to think about where you're placing those temporary berms. Do you have right of entry? Do you have the easements that you need? Are there buildings that have popped up there that maybe aren't legal because they're in those easement areas, and they're the places where your levees are supposed to go? Looking at those things ahead of time, again, can be a big help. And the next thing to think about are, what critical facilities do you have in your community? Where are the priorities for evacuations? Do you have nursing homes or schools or prisons or hospitals where you've got vulnerable people that if they're at higher risk, you're looking at where do you move them? And based on experience of communities, we know, and you can imagine just the trauma that involves, especially in nursing homes, for the residents that are being moved. They're not understanding what's going on. It's very traumatic. The more you can do to plan ahead of time, and even better, keep people out of those areas in the first place. If you've got existing facilities there, looking at what kind of protection plans that are more permanent that you can help reduce the risk in those areas. Here's an example in Cedar Rapids that they had flooding in 2008 here, and then they had these facilities on an island in the middle of the river, and apparently it included their city hall, their county courthouse, and the county jail. And so getting folks out of those areas and having some important government facilities getting flooded was a huge problem, of course, there for them in 2008. Other examples locally in 2014 when we had flooding, here's some pictures of them having to do prep next to Methodist Hospital in St. Louis Park, having some of their beds at risk. The Well House in Owatonna having some flooding since then. And I've got in my notes here that they had 8 inches over 2 days. And following the flood, they did get some of our state flood hazard mitigation grants to help with elevating some of these facilities. And, what areas do you need to evacuate? I talked about certainly the vulnerable, the critical facilities where you've got the nursing homes, prisons, hospitals, those kind of places. But then also what neighborhoods in your community. And this is an example of an RV park or a campground. And it's one where people are basically living there much of the year. So we worked with this community and they were getting elevations at all those spots and identifying areas for them to move to and figuring out what their evacuation plan was going to be. And in general, for campgrounds, we want communities to have their plans. And the flashier the floods are in your area, the more important it is to have a good plan in place. Oh, and I see someone is making a note that the Corps of Engineers plan that we had there was not the most current. So we'll have to look at making sure we update that in our future trainings. Post-disaster, and here it says recipes for disaster. Of course, we're going to be having first responders doing rescues, and that's the top priority immediately after flooding or during flooding, looking at road closures. But then you'll be wanting to get out there and document high water marks, tracking staff time, and I'll say a little bit more about these things. Obviously, you want your first responders out there helping people that are most at risk. We've got a few pictures of the folks being rescued. And of course, with the spring flooding, part of the issue that makes it more difficult is it's the spring thaw. We've got snow and ice blocking things. Looking at what parts of the community are flooded. And they're trying to make sure everybody's okay and everybody who's at risk is out of there. So here's an example of some road closures. And imagine if there's water over those areas that people aren't going to know that there's this huge break in the road. And that definitely, if someone tries driving across there while there's a little water on the road, is a problem. And I've got to say, give a shout out to Winona County. Many of the pictures that are in this presentation were provided by them because they've had quite a few floods there in 2007 and 8, and they really had a lot of impacts. But then there's also a reminder of some of the information to get out there is the reminder of the turnaround, don't drown. And that's something that the National Weather Service has some great resources on that campaign. So again, the turnaround, don't drown. If there's some water over the road, don't drive across there. Here's an example of what might be under that road. And people don't realize that it could be a huge gap like this, or it could be that smaller erosion that I was showing in the earlier slide. But either way, you don't want people driving across those areas. In Minnesota, and I believe nationally, most of the deaths do occur during flooding due to people trying to cross places that they shouldn't be crossing. So also documenting high water levels. Okay, this one was put together to be kind of humorous. And I was told that the statue is actually kind of floating, so this is probably not a legitimate watermark, but it still kind of gets across the story. But here we've got an example where you could see the watermark. They're getting that while they can and putting in different stakes, showing those high water records while you can still see them before the evidence goes away. And there's a lot of good reasons for knowing how high things got for the given storm that you've got for future planning. One more example where they were showing the 100-year. So here you can see it got a little bit above the 100-year. And so they're getting what that actual elevation was. But definitely something communities, once the rescues are done, once it's safe to get out there and be looking at the evidence, you do want to get that at least marked, and then maybe you'll come back later with surveyors, but but now we're able to do a lot more surveying out in the field with the GPS and getting better information fairly quickly. A little thing kind of reminding you that you want to keep track of the staff and volunteer time and how much they're spending, what they're doing in responding to the floods. Because if there is a state or presidential disaster declaration, a lot of that effort can be reimbursed, but you'll need records to show that for getting reimbursement. And some of the post-flood communications, certainly now, in addition to radio and newspapers and things on your website, we've got a lot more of the social media. And in more recent flooding, that's really where a lot of people are getting their information, is on the social media. Oh, and I got to change that to, it's not Twitter anymore, is it? During the flood, you're going to be focused on safety messages. A lot of communities and counties do a good job of getting maps up there or notes about, hey, this road's closed here, that road's closed there, or getting some maps up. And even the DOT's 511 site, they've now got a little water icons that they'll show areas that are impacted by flooding on the major roads, that they show the status on their website. After the flood, folks are going to be clamoring for guidance on what to do with their debris. And you'll need to be talking with citizens and getting information out on, where to call in and schedule inspections, and reminding them of the need for permits, and a reminder that in floodplain areas that they should be getting permits for repairs also, that's something that FEMA made sure that is in our model floodplain ordinance, and very clear that you want to be requiring permits for that, partly so that you don't have work creep there, that they're repairing this and that, and they're not putting on big additions or doing other work while they're there at the same time doing that work, and helping to make sure that they're staying under the substantial improvement criteria. We did have our substantial damage playbook for local officials that was finalized in June of 22. It's available on our website. It's a little hard to dig down and find it, so got the link here. And by the way, those of you who have been on these trainings before, you know that we usually send out PDFs of the presentations within a day or two after giving these presentations. So you don't have to be taking frantic notes trying to see what sites we were sharing, because we will have those as clickable spots in the PDF that gets sent. But one of the first things you're doing as the water goes down is trying to figure out where you've got buildings that might be damaged or substantially damaged. And sometimes it's if you're in a small community, this is an example of a map that was done with the community official and their area hydrologist. Of course, nowadays, much more can be done with your GIS systems. And this was, probably from 2010. So it's getting old here. Now you've got even better systems. But, this was showing nicely where they were seeing damage, and in this example in Blooming Prairie there. And this was work that Steele County did a really nice job in figuring out where their damage was and where they needed to focus on inspections for potential substantial damage. In our playbook, our guidebook for response, we do get into one of the first things you're looking at is whether the buildings with potential damage are in areas regulated by your ordinance. So first you'll be looking at, is it within your community? And then the area where you had the flooding, where are those buildings located? What buildings were in that area? And of those buildings within your community, which ones were in the special flood hazard area that are mapped? So in this example, there were quite a few that were impacted, but some weren't in your jurisdiction, and this one wasn't in the FEMA mapped area. We might encourage them to build safer and smarter afterwards, but it's this building here, number 4, that's in your jurisdiction, that's in that mapped area, where your ordinance applies, and you need to verify if they're substantially damaged or not. We do have this little flow chart that gets into some of the same kinds of things. 10 years old here now, so we could it's probably overdue for a little bit of a refresh along with some of our other brochures. Hopefully helpful, just kind of broad level, what do you need to be looking at? Is it in your community? Is it potentially substantially damaged? If it is, what's allowed? And can they rebuild where they are? If they're in a floodway, then they can't. Some high-level guidance for that. I've already mentioned substantial damage here now a couple of times. I need to talk about what is substantial damage. And that is in your ordinance. This is coming from federal requirements. This is substantial damage definitions and the requirements related to substantial damage. But what it really applies to is the older buildings in your community that were built before you had maps, before you have your current ordinances. And for those existing nonconformities, they're allowed to continue to exist. They can do maintenance and repairs. They were not required to immediately come into compliance with your new regulations. But once they've been substantially damaged, they do need to be brought into compliance. And determining substantial damage, it's going to be based on damage of any origin, so it's not just flooding. In Minnesota, we see a lot of tornadoes. We do see a lot of fires that become issues. The tornadoes are usually getting a bigger swath of your community. Fires tend to be more isolated, and flooding tends to be broader. And what you're looking at is, what does it cost to repair and bring it back to the pre-damage condition? And you're looking at the cost of doing that restoration, whether they do the actual repairs or not. Sometimes people will say, well, I'm just going to do part of the repair to make it livable in this part of the house, so I'm not over 50% because I'm not doing all that work. And what the rules say, what the law says, is you're looking at what would be the cost to bring it back to that pre-damage condition. Again, whether they do the repair or not. You're looking at whether it's over 50% of the market value of the building. It's not the cost to rebuild, it's the market value of the building is what the regulations say. So when should you start looking at these things? And let's see if this works. I'm trying to show the fish flopping on the couch. You should be out there as soon as it's safe for you to be looking at those damages. People are going to want to get back in their house right away, in their building right away. And so we encourage you to get out as soon as you can to see that damage, help people know what the concerns are, whether they can or can't get back in the buildings, and whether they are potentially substantially damaged, and we need more information to make that determination. So here's some examples of the officials out there looking at damage. This must be an area where they're doing a practice. This looks like the real flooding because they've got their safety vests, they're wearing their more protected shoes and looking at the electric systems and looking at the building in a safe manner, have a group, and they've got their checklist of things that they're looking at. So how high did the water get? What systems got damaged? But how high the water got is a key thing that we look at. But also a reminder that people will be out there doing different kinds of inspections. The building code folks are out there looking at whether it's habitable or not. And they could be red tagging the building or putting up the placards here saying, you don't come in this building. You have to make improvements. You have to do something before you're allowed to be in this building again. So they're looking at habitability, and there's some overlap. Some information that they're getting is going to be helpful for looking at substantial damage and these other purposes for inspections. But each of these reasons, they do have different focuses in the inspections they're doing. The assessor's office will be out there. You as local zoning officials need to be out there determining whether it's substantially damaged, where you can go with others who are doing inspections. That's better if you can. You'll have adjusters out there for the insurance or flood insurance or for other insurance adjusters. If there's going to be a possible state or federal declaration, we'll have FEMA or Homeland Security Emergency Management state folks out there, emergency managers out there doing preliminary damage assessments potentially for whether there's going to be a declaration. For preliminary damage assessments, that's something that if they do think it's going to be a bigger flood, our Minnesota Division of Homeland Security Emergency Management is the lead on this. They work with FEMA. If it's a bigger flood, you'll see more FEMA staff involved. But they'll also bring in the health department folks, or DNR might be involved in some of these inspections. And more often, we see the preliminary damage assessments for public assistance, looking at the public facilities, the utilities, the public buildings, public roads, bridges, culverts, those kinds of things. Most of our declarations are public assistance. Sometimes they'll be looking at individual buildings, the homes and businesses, to see if it hits the trigger for individual assistance, but that's pretty rare that we see individual assistance declarations at the state or federal level. And in the bigger floods, we'll also see volunteer organizations like the Red Cross are out there helping to figure out where the damage is and where people need help. And FEMA did have this info sheet giving examples of some of the people who would be there and were legitimate for being there. Also, there's a need to give citizens warnings about contractors that will come out that aren't so legitimate, trying to get people to do repairs and get paid to do work that they don't do properly, or they take the big deposits and they leave. So there definitely are unscrupulous businesses that get out there during disasters, and something to watch out for. In fact, here they talk about some of the scammers, making sure that folks work with good contractors that are licensed and all those kinds of things. So the local ordinance says in your floodplain ordinance, you're responsible for determining if buildings have been substantially damaged. So you need to do the review of the building. And again, even if it's damage due to tornadoes or something else, you need to be out there looking at the buildings that are in your floodplain areas and checking, are they substantially damaged? Is it clear they're substantially damaged? Then that's pretty straightforward. They can't be using that building. They have to rebuild properly and bring it into compliance. There will also be some that you can see that, yeah, they're going to need some repairs, but it's clear they're not substantially damaged. So you'll make that determination they're not substantially damaged. You'll give them a repair permit. And there will be those that it's hard to say. You're going to have to go into more detail to figure out if they're substantially damaged or not. So, and you'll want to be inspecting all the impacted areas again that are within your floodplain. And you may not know about some of them at first, but those of you in experience will know that when you start seeing all the debris out there piling up on the curbside, pretty good sign that you've got damage in that building. And as I said, some of the determinations are going to be easy. This is from a FEMA document here showing this building clearly substantially damaged. FEMA does have this bulletin here. It's a few years old now, but from 2018 with some nice summary about substantially improved, substantially damaged building. And here's an example of a building. It's some kind of a shed here. They've got a little bit of flooding. You're going to want to mark that water line. That's useful information to have. But it's a metal building. They've got probably just a slab on grade, just the slab for a floor. So this is one you can see it's not going to be substantially damaged. They're going to be able to hose things down, clean it up. If they had any materials in there, they might have some stuff to get out of there and dispose of properly, but you can give them a repair permit if there was any damage other than having to clean it off. And as you're doing those inspections, you want to make sure that you're getting those records, you're taking pictures, making the measurements of how high is this off the floor. Well, this one looks like they've got some utility possible damage too. Typically, if the damage is just in the building, it's not substantially damaged. but they might have some repairs to do. And you might encourage them to elevate some of those utilities. And one more example, documenting where that debris line, that mud line is from the flood. Because once things get cleaned up, it's harder to see where that is. You want to document it while you've got the evidence that you can see. And some of the windshield surveys can be deceiving. Here's an example where you can see the line where the mud got to on these shrubs and maybe on the building, although with that dark color, I'm not seeing it here. But here's an example of if you go around to the back, you see that they had a lot more damage that you didn't see from the street side. So when you are doing inspections, you want to be trying to look around the buildings because you may or may not see all the damage just doing the quick windshield survey. Again, Winona had some great photos of the damage that they saw in 2007 and 8 era. A mess there, but they were getting the documentation of where the damage was. In our playbook, we do have some depth grids or depth charts here, giving an idea of how much damage you have on different kinds of buildings. Understandably, that if you've got a one-story building and the flooding gets up on that main floor, you're more likely to have significant damage than if the flooding is just in the basement, or if it's a masonry building, like that shed that we were showing. It's masonry or it's all metal. You're less likely to have the damage. Mobile homes, basically, if the flooding touches them, they're going to be substantially damaged. Pretty much everyone that I've talked to involved in flood response, every one of them talks about mobile homes, manufactured homes. You get water even on the underside of them, it wicks up and you've got substantial damage. And zooming in on one of the examples here, so this one-story slab floor building, that it doesn't take much water on that building before you're typically getting into that 50% range. So we use this as a guide to help you triage which buildings you need to be looking at more closely. And when they are possibly substantially damaged, you'll want to do a more detailed review. We have different kinds of checklists and information. If in a really big flood, we can bring in folks. There's mutual aid types of agreements in place. We've got agreements that building officials can help out in other parts of the state. Really big ones, we can bring in folks from other states. In fact, the picture I had of Montana provided, they were helping out in South Carolina, or South Carolina was helping out Montana, then Montana was helping other states. Anyway, we do see help coming from other areas as we get into the bigger floods. We talked about, it looks like I repeated this slide. Sorry about that. For substantial improvement, I guess that's why I was just pointing out this was substantial damage we were talking about, but for substantial improvement, we also look at that when people are repairing from floods, sometimes they decide they're going to do other improvements at the same time. And substantial improvement is looking at reconstruction, rehabilitation, additions, or other improvements. We're looking at, is that more than 50% of the structure market value, again, before the start of construction? And substantial improvement, there is wording in the definition of substantial improvement in the regulations that says it's that cost what you're doing for improvements and repairs and maintenance within basically a year period is the way we've got it written in our sample ordinance. It does specifically say you don't include the cost of repairing previously identified health and safety violations. If a unit of government, if some official has red tagged their electric system or their furnace or whatever, that you don't include the cost to make that repair. When they go and start doing their improvements, they can't say, oh, well, this should have been red tagged, and so we're not going to include those costs. It has to have actually been red tagged by a local official in advance of them doing the project. The other exception is when you're altering a historic structure, that as long as it's going to continue to meet that historic designation, then there's a lot of the costs that don't get included, and they're not considered substantial. They don't have to meet some of those substantial improvement requirements. And FEMA does have a document that gets into more detail. If you have a historic building, that's something that we can help you look through what resources are available, or get some input on how to interpret what things do or don't need to be included in making your determination. Kind of the main reference that FEMA has, their desk reference. This is probably a good half-inch thick document. It is available electronically. It's been, oh heck, this is getting older now. I don't know I think if they're working on an update or not, but it does have a lot of good information in there. And it's got some flow charts to help you kind of figure out what part of the document to look at, the desk reference. And it's got some good information on estimating market value and estimating costs. And it points out that you've got to be looking at the market value for the structure. Reminder that the regulations say it's the structure only. You're not looking at the land or other accessory structures. You're looking at just that affected structure when you're looking at whether it's 50% or more of that structure. And for many of our properties, the land is really the valuable part, and they might have a small, less expensive structure there. And so they're more likely to be getting into that substantial damage, substantial improvement situation. We recommend, for sure, you want a consistent method. And the most common way that communities are looking at that is they're looking at what's the assessed value for taxes. And the nice thing is that in your assessed values for taxes, they do separate the land value from the building value. So you've got that to work with. And so work with your county assessor. In some counties, you might know that you need to adjust it by a multiplier. In the state of Minnesota, you're supposed to have your assessed value be within fairly close of the actual market value. So they're usually pretty close, but there might be some adjustments that counties know that they need to make in your county. Other states, I've heard about how the assessed values are way off from the market value, and they definitely have to make some adjustments. The other important thing is that you have an appeal process. The most typical way folks will appeal that is to have an official appraisal done. And that updated, more exact appraisal can be used for determining that market value, for determining whether it's substantially damaged or not. And then if it does show that that building is much more valuable, then you're going to be sharing it with your assessor's office. In the latest DNR sample permit forms, that includes information for buildings, we do have some triggers and reminders of what to look at for evaluating the project costs for non-conforming structures. So if it's useful for you, use it, great. Otherwise, you might find other example forms more useful. Back to the FEMA guidance, in that desk reference, they do have a page where they get into more detail on what has to be included in those cost determinations. You do have to include the value of donated or discounted materials. That they can't say, oh, well, the guys at the church just dropped off this stuff and donated it, so it didn't cost me anything. Well, no, you have to look at what it would have cost if you had purchased that material in your community. The other thing is the labor costs of the owner or other volunteer labor. You should be looking at a contractor's bid of what it would cost to do that project. In fact, here the contractor's overhead and profit should be included in there. So the best thing to be doing is requiring that they're showing some contractors' bids by contractors familiar with what the costs are in that area. Because it does vary by regions of the state, certainly by regions of the country, what it costs to do different kinds of projects. Things that you don't have to include would be things like, the cleanup, trash removal, permit fees, inspection fees, surveys, outside improvements that aren't part of the building, some of these kinds of things. It gives some nice examples of the things that you don't have to include when you're making that determination. And we do have this sample determination letter that you can use in our playbook here. You put it on your city letterhead, a formal letter. You're going to want to have a documentation trail as you're working with folks. They won't be happy about being told that they've got substantially damaged buildings and they need to bring things into compliance. Oh, and one of the things we note here is that letter, in addition to talking about that they need to bring their building into compliance, if they're, again, within that FEMA mapped area and subject to your ordinance, remind them that if they do have flood insurance, that there is the increased cost of compliance. It's basically a rider, like a rider on their insurance policy if they have the NFIP flood insurance policy. If they're substantially damaged, they can get up to the $30,000 to help with that extra cost of elevating, floodproofing, or whatever they might be doing. A little bit more information on this in these next couple slides, that if they do have that flood insurance policy and their damage is flooding, because it's the flood insurance policy, right now ICC pays up to $30,000. That's something that's been discussed at the national level, that they should really be increasing that amount. But at least currently, it's up to $30,000, can be used for the cost to bring that building into compliance. So the acronym that we remember for what's eligible is FRED. Floodproofing, if it's a non-residential building, it's a commercial building and they're allowed to do floodproofing. Moving it to another part of the lot or different site, that cost to relocate, the cost to elevate that building, and the cost of demolition. In order to get that ICC money, the floodplain administrator, that local zoning administrator, must make that substantial damage determination. The flood building has to be in the floodplain for them to get the ICC money, and that they need to bring that structure into compliance with the local ordinance. So if there are higher local standards, you can be noting that they can be getting their ICC money to be bringing it in compliance with the local ordinance. But they do need the letter from the community to start that process. So here's an example of a house. This is actually provided by a fellow that we worked with in Rock County. Anyways, one of the counties in Illinois. He's the ICC guru for local officials, a guy named Ray. Anyway, Ray provided this picture of the building that was flooded and then showing the building being elevated. And I can see that they're using the internal floodproofing technique that's allowed for residential structures. In Minnesota, it requires a conditional use permit for residential structures. In this example, they did the full level elevation, and I'm sure they're using part of that building as parking. When it's that internally flood-proofed technique, they've got their flood vents, it's flood-resistant materials. They can only use it for parking and storage. It's not a habitable area. But anyway, this is an example of one that I know got ICC money to do this elevation. So the other thing is, what does trigger the substantial damage and being eligible for ICC, or what are some higher standards? The federal minimum is the 50% damage, that if it's over 50% damage, that you've got to require them to rebuild. And that's also when they're eligible to get the ICC. In our state model ordinance, we have had a cumulative substantial improvement language in our model for decades, trying to encourage over time getting improvements done and not having people spend a lot of money making improvements and then having it still be at risk for the main part of the building. But another thing that we've added in our model ordinance is the repetitive loss language, because they're eligible for ICC for sure if it's that over 50%, but there's language for ICC saying if you have 2 flood-related damage claims within 10 years, and the average damage is over 25%. So basically, you add it together and it's over 50%. But on average, it's 25% for these 2 times within 10 years. You're also eligible to get that $30,000 for the increased cost of compliance. But it has to be in the community's ordinance for that to be triggered. And I know we've had a couple counties that actually just added that language recently because they had flooding on the Mississippi. Someone was damaged, like 30%. They weren't able to collect their ICC money, which they had hoped they'd be able to do because the community didn't have that language in their ordinance. Now they've got it there, so if there are damage in the future, that person would be eligible for that assistance. So just ending with a few examples of improvements that are useful to make for the future. Here they use some of the money available from different flood reduction projects, encouraging relocating utilities. If it's not a substantial improvement, it's not mandatory, but you can make it a requirement in your ordinance that if utilities are damaged, that they relocate them higher. And that's something we certainly would encourage. Oh, I see I'm down to just a couple minutes here. So a reminder that we do have the DNR's general permit for making repairs post-flood, but sometimes in-kind replacement's not the best alternative. With the public assistance program, there is something where we can get some assistance for better projects that mitigate things better. And that's something we'll talk about more in the presentation we're giving on April 8th on post-flood and the resources available, the public assistance, individual assistance project. But just to mention that, keeping your hazard mitigations up to plan, looking at areas to do mitigation, looking at willing sellers for buyouts. Here showing the improvements they made in Granite Falls and way nicer in future floods. Here we had a lot of people at risk even during the flood. And the mayor, who's now passed away, but Mayor Dave was talking about how they realized, gee, we had all our volunteers in those slippery areas handing sandbags along, and we were lucky nobody was injured seriously or killed. Before the flood, they had all these buildings on the riverside, and after the flood, they bought out a lot of these buildings. They put up a little levee to protect those neighborhoods. We've got one holdout here, but they've done a lot of great job reducing risk at the neighborhood level. And East Grand Forks, they pulled their levee back and made this into recreational space. We've got lots of good information on our website. And we'll end right there at during times of flooding, you're responding, you're dealing with those floods, and take advantage of those low water periods to be planning for the future. So that is what I had in my presentation. So thanks everyone for attending.
Thanks everybody.